Hi, this is my review of Journey to Arkaban. Journey to Arkaban is a dark fantasy adventure for the Shadow of the Demon Lord role-playing game. I have yet to review the core rulebook of that RPG, but if you are looking for something quite demonic when it comes to dark fantasy, with some bleak scenarios, some very questionable activities and acts within the adventures and the campaigns, I highly recommend Shadow of the Demon Lord. And in this adventure, you not only get an adventure module, you also have new rules for traveling, for journeys across the map. And this adventure is so flexible that it is replayable, but even if you do not want to run this adventure more than once, the encounters are disconnected enough from the main focus of the adventure to use them in other adventures and campaigns. It's not that they are not leading the player characters towards their destination, but rather they are events that happen as disconnected forces from the main point of the quest. So it feels quite realistic in that sense, that when you are looking for something, when you are trying to reach an objective, you're going to find many things along the way, places, people that are not necessarily related to your objective. Now let's talk about the quality of the PDF. I only have two criticisms, one minor criticism and one more significant criticism, I would say, when it comes to the quality. The minor criticism is that I spotted a couple of typos. However, they won't present an obstacle when understanding the content of this adventure module, which is also a toolkit, I guess you could say. And my other criticism is that many, if not all of the illustrations, feel more on the fantasy, high fantasy type of flavor, rather than the bleak, demonic Shadow of the Demon Lord type of art that you would expect to see in many of its source books and adventures. But everything else is great. The document is well organized and written. You will understand quite clearly how to use all of the encounters and the travel rules in this document. The organization and the presentation of everything that is going on within this adventure makes it very easy to run the adventure and use the sort of journey toolkit included in all of your future adventures and campaigns. You have bookmarks and you have a fully hyperlinked table of contents, so it's going to be very easy for you to move throughout the entire document. So overall, despite my couple of criticisms, the quality is really good. Now let's talk about the contents. The premise of the adventure is quite simple. There is this mythical city of Arkaban. It is a dwarven city, or was a dwarven city, and it is kind of like Shangri-La or El Dorado, those mythical cities that you do not know if they actually existed or exist, or if you do not know if you find something that could be that city, the site itself, but maybe it's some other city apart. So Arkaban is kind of like that. It's something that you do not know if it's the stuff of legends or if it's actually something that existed and that you can potentially find in present times, at least within this adventure. In fact, the ending is quite random and open-ended. You never know what the player characters are going to encounter at the end of their journey. Maybe there is some truth to Arkaban. Maybe it was all just a fool's quest for something that was just an illusion, or perhaps even a delusion. The player characters are going to be hired by this non-player character by the name of Uncle Spanky. This is an aged and potentially insane dwarven scholar. He thinks that he knows the way to Arkaban, even though many have searched for the city and have found nothing. He supposedly has this map and the key or the way to open up the entrance into Arkaban. So this could be a fool's errand, but because Uncle Spanky is going to pay really well, the player characters are probably going to undertake this journey. Now, before we get into the encounters and all the things that the group could find in their journey towards Arkaban, let's talk about the alternate travel rules. These rules divide the journey phase or travel phase in steps. So every time you are moving from one place to another, first you determine the route that you're going to take. You could take the fastest way or the safest way. Maybe you could take into consideration some geographical features. Then the players determine the route planner. This is a role within the party. This is the one who is going to plan the trip before the entire group gets started on their journey. The ideal attribute for a route planner is intellect. Then you determine the travel segments. The game master must determine how many segments the travel plan contains. Many things are going to happen within those segments. There is no set distance that each segment represents. Instead, you use a new segment when the factors of the journey change. The game master should split a route into different segments when terrain or hostility changes. Then you assign segment details. This is divided in phases. First, you have length, the estimated time it will take to traverse the segment. All segments must have a length assigned. Maybe a segment takes 3 days or less to move through it, or maybe it's quite a large segment because of the terrain, quite a stretch of land, and it could take greater than a week to move through it. Then you determine the terrain. All segments have terrain assigned to them. It could be a hilly area, or maybe it's quite swampy, or there are mountains. And you also determine the weather. The weather could perhaps be calm or extreme. And then you determine the hostility that you're going to find in that segment. Maybe it's actually quite peaceful, or maybe there is violence. Then you compute the total danger rating for that particular segment. Because the different elements consisting of length, terrain, weather, etc., they're going to have a danger value assigned to them. And the total is going to be the danger rating for that segment. After that, you assign travel roles. The players must assign roles, and the main role is that of the guide. The guide is there to lead the group through the countryside safely. They use the information and the skills of the rest of the group to aid in the journey. The guide will decide the success or failure of each segment that the group travels through, although they could receive help from other roles. Their most important attribute is perception. Only one character can take this guide role. You also have the roles of the sentry, which is ensuring the safety of the group as they journey on. So you could basically be a lookout, thinking about defensive positions, setting watches. And the most important attribute for this role is strength. There could be multiple characters being sentries. You also have the scout. The scout is about finding the best path to move through, to navigate the terrain. The scout skills can provide a recourse for difficult terrain. And the most important attribute is agility. Multiple characters can also be scouts. Now, the most important role that you need to consider is guide. You could be without sentries or scouts. It's going to be more difficult to move through the different segments that way, but the role of guide is the only thing that's going to be mandatory. Next, you test the route. The route planner must make an intellect challenge roll. For each segment in the route greater than 1, you add a bane to the roll. You also determine if the route planner has traveled this route before. If yes, you roll as normal, but if not, you add a bane to the test route roll. So this is important when it comes to the danger rating. If the route planner has an applicable profession, you also add that as a boon. So if you do really well on your roll, you reduce the overall danger rating of all the segments by 1. But maybe you didn't roll so well, and you gain a bane on all encounter checks for all segments. Then is the step of travel. The characters begin to make their way along the route. You repeat this step for each segment. There could be some situational modifiers. There could be some positive things like favorable winds, good roads to travel, or there could be some negative things like polluted air or impassable bridges. Positive modifiers grant a boon, and negative modifiers grant a bane. And this will apply in a future phase known as the segment outcome. Before that, you determine role proficiency. All characters assigned a role must make a challenge test to determine the overall group success in following the route. This includes keeping themselves safe, finding food, sticking to the path, and if the characters in a role have an applicable profession, they add a boon. So maybe you do quite well in this role, reducing the overall danger rating, but maybe you fail at the role and you add more banes. Then you average all boons and banes and you move on to the determined segment outcome. The guide makes a perception challenge roll. He includes all banes or boons. You then compare the result of the perception challenge roll to the danger rating of the current segment, and you compare the result to a set of tables, that could result in no encounters, some easy encounters, or perhaps some very hard encounters. And so that's basically it. There are some specific things related, like for example, that the game master should never suggest how many segments a trip will take to keep a sort of balance, difficulty and uncertainty. But for the most part, you're going to be repeating these steps for each segment, and that's how you're going to encounter many things throughout your journeys. Many hazards, maybe some positive things, many monsters, and dangerous non-player characters as well. So it is up to the creativity of the game master to present some interesting encounters following the results of these tables. You can easily take the encounters presented in the journey to Arkaban and tweak them, modify them, use them as they are if you didn't employ them when you were running the adventure, or use them as examples to come up with your own encounters, many things related to the weather, to the things that the characters are going to encounter, both natural and unnatural, structures, ruins, etc. Now let's talk more about the adventure itself. The player characters could attempt to hire a guide if they are not very confident in setting a guide within their group. You have several options here on how to handle that, including a table to determine how skilled that guide is, but the characters could also attempt things on their own, as you probably have realized from the travel rules that I just covered. But whatever it is that the player characters decide to do, the game master needs to determine the number of segments using a table. So you can randomly determine how many segments the player characters are going to move through. Or if the game master prefers it, he could ignore these tables and plan out the journey however he likes, depending on the encounters that he wants to insert into the adventure. Besides that table to determine segments, you have many tables to determine the length of the journey, the terrain, the weather, the level of hostility. So these tables are great for you to come up with your own tables for your own adventures, because in the case of this adventure module, the terrain consists of hills, forests and mountains. So if you're going to be having an adventure in a colder area, or perhaps a desert type of area, you can modify that terrain table however you wish, and the weather of course. Now concerning this particular path that the player characters are going to take, there are 27 scenes, 27 potential encounters that they can have along the way. These scenes and encounters are very easy to tweak and modify depending on what the game master wants for this particular adventure, and for many other adventures of course. Now let me read to you some of the things that the player characters are going to encounter in each of these segments. If it's an area with hills, maybe there is some sort of easy path to follow, there is calm weather, and the player characters can interact with one another, with the guide that they hired if they decided to hire a guide, but they can also interact with Uncle Spanky, that is actually pretty likable despite his potential insanity, but he gets a bit closed up or in a bad mood if the player characters doubt his knowledge to find Arkaban. Or maybe the player characters could be attacked by a swarm of animals, and that's not all. Many things could be haunting these untrodden or not frequented as much paths. Maybe the player characters encounter shadows. Maybe they face a rock slide if the weather becomes quite turbulent or inclement. They could also risk drowning depending on where they are moving through. Maybe they encounter a lake that is not as calm as it appears. Maybe they go into this fog and they get lost, having more violent encounters than usual, or just having a difficult time finding their way out. They could risk suffocation if they go into toxic areas. Now, if they go up or through the hills, they could be in the hunting ground of dangerous predators. But this also means that this particular zone could have some prey for the player characters to hunt and eat. They could also find magical items. That could give a hint that they are on the right track towards Arkaban. Maybe they bump into a group of dwarves, and if they are not careful, Uncle Spanky could create some sort of fight or brawl, or something a bit more lethal, so they have to be careful. Uncle Spanky is not exactly respected by all the dwarves. Maybe they could run into a cockatrice, into bears, orcs, into dangerous flora and fauna. They could bump into demons and cultists, minotaurs and beastmen, giants. There could even be a killing mist. If you thought that the fog was bad, the killing mist is even worse. And if they go into a forested area, they could bump into a nymph in the middle of her bath, that is, she's completely naked in a pool of water, and she will be quite angry because of this trespassing, of this dishonor, this attack towards her intimacy, and she will demand some sort of recompense, or she will attack the player characters and kill them if possible. There are also some unexpected and weird encounters, like for example, they could end up encountering a group of gremlins that are dissecting a clockwork, and they are not too pleased with the player characters spying on them while they are having their fun. The weather could become quite inclement. There could also be quicksand, many hazards related to terrain. There could be a wildfire, a tornado, a heat wave, and if the player characters decide to set up camp, they could be attacked in the middle of the night by one of the large beasts inhabiting this area, some very strange creatures. But not all is hostile. They could have some favorable encounters. They could run into some beings of the Fae. Even if the player characters do not notice them, they could take a liking for the entire group or for a single PC, and the PC could get some favor, some unexpected boon throughout the journey. You could also run into other species and races that are not particularly aggressive altogether, and you could have some diplomatic encounters and gain something from them, perhaps. They could also run into an encounter with mutated and contaminated animals. The player characters could even stumble into the middle of an ancient battlefield, and depending on how long they stay there, they could have some really grave encounters, to put it literally. They could also encounter an evil priest during the middle of his ceremony, and they could have a fight with the priest and the mob and the beasts that they are summoning. They could also run into a plague of locusts, and if the player characters do not watch where they step, they could easily walk on top of black goo and it will attack you. And there are many unseen dangers, some traps even. If you're not careful, you will become the prey of some unseen hunters moving through the area. And even if the weather is relatively calm and there aren't too many hostile creatures moving about, the player characters will need to make some hard choices if they want to take the longer path or risk a shortcut by jumping over a gap or climbing up a treacherous surface. And some non-player characters that the group encounters could need some help, and if the player characters manage to rescue perhaps an elf or a mountaineer that is about to fall, they could receive some help in return. You never know. There are also some extreme dangers. Uncle Spanky is not exactly very stable emotionally speaking, and they could deal with a severe depression on the part of Uncle Spanky. Another interesting thing is that if the player characters decide that their guide is not too skilled, or their own guide, that is one member of the group, is not exactly having an easy time navigating this area, they could encounter a kobold that will offer to become a guide for the player characters. It is up to them if they want to trust this creature or not. And when it comes to the extreme weather, there could be a lightning storm. And because of this, they could try to take shelter inside of a lair, and this lair belongs to a drake. There are even some places hidden within the mountains that contain some riches and provisions. For example, you could find some eggs that you could use for your breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Just make sure that you stay away from that area in case the game master decides that the one that laid those eggs returns and is quite angry. They could also find a cache with jewels and gold. However, troglodytes, harpies, and bandits also move through this area. Vampire bats and even vampires become a menace throughout the night. The player characters could possibly find a mysterious portal that could take them to Arkaban itself. Once the player characters reach Arkaban and manage to decipher how to get into this abandoned and mythical site, you have a table of endings to randomly determine what's the truth behind Arkaban. Maybe Arkaban is actually a secret kingdom. Maybe Arkaban is a trap of death. Maybe Arkaban is the lair of a worm. Or maybe it's an entire hidden realm. Or it's just a myth. Or maybe a tomb. Now let me read to you some of the things that could result from these endings. When it comes to Arkaban, the secret kingdom, days ago, the player characters thought that they heard a horn. It was distant, but the echo seemed fairly clear. Well, it turns out that there is actually an entire population of dwarves living in Arkaban, and Uncle Spanky decides to stay with them. There is more to this encounter than that, of course, but that's the main gist of it. Maybe Arkaban is the home of blood. Sweat drips off the player character's brow as they ascend higher and higher into the mountains. The tribulations of the last days and weeks weigh heavily on their minds. And they should be nervous, because in this place there's actually a ritual and ceremonial arrangement to summon a demon. And now the player characters have stumbled into the demon's trap, and they will have to fight for their lives. And there are just so many things that could happen with these random endings. Maybe Arkaban was actually destroyed by still active volcanoes, so the player characters will have to move through craters and liquid death, as lava and toxic vapors will try to claim the player characters' lives. Or Arkaban could actually be infested with undead. Or maybe Arkaban was never dwarven at all. Maybe it was actually a place of refuge for elves and beings of the Fae. Or maybe Arkaban never existed. But Uncle Spanky is quite enthusiastic to initiate another expedition. It is up to the players and the game master if they want to continue helping Uncle Spanky in unraveling the mystery of Arkaban. And that is pretty much it when it comes to the adventure module. So overall, what do I think of Journey to Arkaban? I think giving a final opinion on Journey to Arkaban is somewhat complex because it possesses two things. That is, this module contains two things that could be seen as either positive or negative things. First, the entire adventure or the set of encounters, they feel a bit generic. They are not as bleak and terrifying and horrifying as other adventures and modules in the Shadow of the Demon Lord adventure line. For example, let's talk about that encounter with the nymph. You see this being of the forest, very beautiful, taking a bath in a pool, and if the player characters see her naked, she's going to get quite angry and she will attack them if they do not find a way to apologize for their intrusion. I think this encounter could have been a bit more horrifying, a bit more into the theme of Shadow of the Demon Lord, if perhaps this dryad was in this pool and there were corpses floating all around. You could see like blood mixing with the clear water of the pool, and those corpses perhaps used to belong to adventurers that stumbled into this pool as well, so the dryad killed them, and so it's going to be a contrasting and nightmarish sight to see this beautiful female entity taking a bath in the middle of the blood of her recent victims. And some of the more monstrous encounters with shadows and undead and such, they also feel slightly generic in their presentation, in that you could easily take them and insert them into your average Dungeons and Dragons campaign and they wouldn't feel out of place. That is, the player characters could think, oh well, this is expected of Dungeons and Dragons, but they would never think, oh, this should be in a Shadow of the Demon Lord adventure module. So that's the thing with the encounters in this adventure module. It doesn't feel like it reaches that level of bleakness or nightmarish splendor that you would expect to find in a Shadow of the Demon Lord adventure. Not that it's out of the theme, but it's just barely there in that dark spectrum. But this could also be a positive thing, like I told you, because this gives you a lot of room to further tweak and modify the aesthetics and details of each of these encounters to make them as horrifying and terrible as you want them. It's also quite easy to take these encounters and use them in other role-playing games. So if you're someone who likes to cut and paste things from different games and use them in other role-playing games, this is a good adventure module for that. Now, the other consideration is that several of the encounters are completely disconnected from the quest for Arkaban. So some players could think that they are too out of the way or too set aside from the main quest, from the myth and the legend, and perhaps they could feel like the build-up is quite unsatisfactory. But this also means that you can use these different encounters in many other adventures and campaigns, and looking at it from a realistic angle within the fictional context, it also makes sense that not all of the things that you're going to encounter during your journey are going to be related to Arkaban. So with those things in mind, I would recommend that you get Journey to Arkaban, and this is a potentially must-have adventure module because it's also a toolkit with the new travel rules and the different encounters, the random endings for Arkaban. Maybe you can take some of those endings and use them in other adventures that are not related to Arkaban. Maybe it's another mythical city of whatever name that you want to give to it. And this also points out to what I would consider to be the greatest strength of the adventure itself, and it's that perhaps you want the ending that Arkaban is just a myth and the player characters do not encounter anything, but now you have an entire campaign. You have a platform to begin a long storyline with the player characters assisting Uncle Spanky in finally getting to Arkaban, and they are going to be bumping into each of these ending scenarios along the way. They will encounter the Worm's Lair, the Arkaban as a tomb that it was actually, maybe it was not Arkaban, it was some other city. Or when they go into Arkaban thinking that it's actually the city of the dwarves and it's actually the city of the elves that I mentioned. So effectively, this adventure module can turn into an entire campaign focusing on the quest for the truth behind the myth, for a city that is probably radically different from what Uncle Spanky has been researching throughout the years. And maybe you want to set Arkaban as that lost civilization where Uncle Spanky finally finds his place as the ending for the campaign. So in that way, it is not a set of random endings, but a sequence of endings according to your adventures in this new campaign scheme. So if you are looking for new travel rules, a toolkit for encounters, and an adventure that you can tweak and modify however you like, that has so many random elements, but also so many ways in which you can arrange those random elements into a sequence for a complete campaign or further adventures, I highly recommend that you get Journey to Arkaban. And I also recommend that you check out other adventures written by Jason Duff. They are quite on the darker side, that is dark sci-fi, dark fantasy. I actually think that those adventures fit the Shadow of the Demon Lord theme a bit more. Even the sci-fi one, you could easily change some things to adapt it to Shadow of the Demon Lord. Maybe they are not robots, they are not androids, they are actually clockworks that went mad. You need to check out those adventures to see what I am talking about. But I definitely would have considered it a plus or an improvement if Jason used his dark creativity from those modules into this Journey to Arkaban adventure module. But like I said, despite that, this is a really solid adventure module to get, and an adventure toolkit to use in your Shadow of the Demon Lord adventures and campaigns. Well, thanks for watching my review, and thank you so much to those that have been sending Drive-Thru-RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you and see you later.